Today we will be hearing from Stephanie Sciarro, a prolific Boston area writer. Stephanie will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A for about 15 or 20 minutes. So we should be done by 3:15. This program will be posted on the library's YouTube channel if you know anyone who wanted to come but couldn't make it today, and it will also be shown on the Needham channel. Let me tell you about Stephanie. She's a journalist, a writing instructor, and the author of 8 nonfiction and 1 fiction book. Is that about right? Which is to come. Her published books include The Great Boston Fire, The Inferno That Nearly Incinerated the City, and The Coconut Grove Fire, A Boston Tragedy. She's also written about the Combat Zone, the history of drinking in Boston, the Brinks robbery, the Boston Harbor Islands, and she wrote a guidebook to Boston's mobsters. Her novel, Cat Dreaming, is in the works. She will be teaching communications at Boston University in the fall, and she's worked as an editor and reporter for many publications, including the Herald and the Glow. Please welcome Stephanie Sciarro.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Margaret. Thank you so much, Bruce. Thank you for inviting me here. I really enjoy talking about my books, so I'm very grateful for this opportunity. And I love libraries, don't you? And we love libraries. So thank you very much. Hopefully everyone can hear me. If at any point you can't hear me, just wave in the back, and I will speak louder or will adjust the volume. So just to let you know about that. So thank you again for inviting me here. So as Margaret pointed out, I'm the author of a number of books about Boston history. For example, fires, drinking, sex, crime, the good stuff. The really good stuff about Boston. And actually, I make that a point to say that because I like writing this kind of people's history. I like writing about things that really affect people's lives. And fire is one of those things that affects people's lives, for better, for worse. And I've written a number of books about that, and I'm going to tell you about one big one today. So let me start off by asking, people always ask, well, why do you want to write about this fire that happened more than 100 years, 1872, a long time ago? Why are you so interested in it? And there are two answers to that question. One is just to pure scale, this fire. This is downtown Boston right after the fire. It continues here. This is the panorama. And you can just see, if you didn't know anybody, you would say that there was a nuclear attack or a bombing. That was the city after the fire. So this was a massive fire that really took out a lot of the downtown Boston. Yeah. Oh, sure, that would be great. Yeah, let's, if that doesn't screw up the, yeah. Is that better, guys? Okay, great. I operate better in the dark anyway, so this is, so as long as it's okay with the filming, this is great. So, and the other reason that I want to talk about it, and I'm just because I'm kind of literate, my mother was an English teacher, so I get into this stuff, but this is a line from Ozymandias by Shelley, which basically is saying, remember me, I'm a great king and there's nothing left of his kingdom. And the thing about this fire, and this is an actual watercolor of the fire, is that it was so massive and so big, people thought, no one's ever going to forget about this. This is going to be a big issue for years and years, decades and decades. And it was for about 50 decades, and then about 70, then 100, and then it's slowly being forgotten about. And one example I'm going to draw in is when I was writing this book. It was the middle of the pandemic. In fact, I started just as the pandemic hit. I finished it during the pandemic, and I make references to the pandemic in my book, and there was some reasons for that. But reading it now, I thought, we're never going to get through this. We're never going to get over it. We're never going to forget about it. And I think we're already starting to forget. So I think one of the things about history is we have to keep repeating it. We have to keep exploring it because there are many lessons that we can learn from this great fire of so long ago that are applicable today. So that's my little introduction and why we're going to talk about it. So looking back in 1872, Boston had about 250,000 people. It was a busy port city. It was a center of commerce. It was the Athens of America, but it had a lot of industrial, exported a lot of wholesale goods in this time. This is a look at the City Hall. It was a city very proud of itself. You know, this was, we have the intellectual giants of the country. We also do a lot of commerce. So it was full of itself. Let's be blunt. The Bostonians were known for being full of themselves. And that even though they were very proud of things, there were some flaws that were becoming apparent. For example, in the downtown area of Boston, this was an area, and we're talking about Washington Street, you know, where Filene's used to be, and where Macy's is now, and Jordan Marsh, that kind of that area of the city, and down into the financial district. This is the area that I'm talking about. And it was a neighborhood of gracious homes. A lot of people had lived there, but it now had transitions into it being a center of commerce. And so these new buildings were being built. Huge, absolutely huge buildings, 4, 5, even 6 stories tall. And this was changing the character of this downtown. It was all very beautiful, and these new buildings were like homages to the forces of capitalism. But there were some flaws in that. They had like architectural frills, and some of those were not as safe as you might imagine. One thing is that the Boston Fire Department was considered at that time to be one of the best in the country. No hands, this was not hubris. This was actual truth. It was very well trained. The fire department was mostly volunteer, but the people were very, very devoted. This is a look at one of the companies with the height of the technology of the day, which were these horse-drawn steam engines. And that was, they were actually fairly effective in terms of generating pressure from water source and getting it on a fire. So the city was very proud of its fire department, but there were flaws, and here were some of them. One is that in this downtown area, the water system that was meant to feed the firefighting apparatuses was outdated. It was built at a time when there were houses there, and now there was these multi-level buildings there, so it just didn't have enough water. The other thing was there were a lack of fire stations in this downtown area. I mean, there were a number of them, but not enough. And why? Not very different from what we see today. That area, that land there was becoming very expensive. So we don't need another fire station, not when we can put up a huge building and make a lot of money out of it. So there was not enough fire stations in that area. There were these use of something called the mansard roof, which is an architectural frill, a wooden structure that goes on top of these buildings, considered the height of elegance, but they were flammable. In fact, someone would later describe them as elevated lumber yards. So even though they were very nice looking, they were potentially very dangerous. And they had a problem with the fire hydrants. There were fire hydrants all over the city, and there were cisterns, but some of the couplings of that didn't work as well with later. They used the Boston hydrants, and the Lowry hydrants were a newer hydrant and were more effective, but it would cost something to replace them. Now, how do we know about all these problems? So that's because of this gentleman here, John Damrell. John Damrell was the chief engineer. That's what they call him in those stories, engineer. But he was the chief of the Boston Fire Department. It was an elected position, oddly enough. He was elected to that position. But he was a firefighter's firefighter. He had been a volunteer firefighter from a very young age. He had family members who were in the firefighting service. And so he had worked in firefighting for many years as a volunteer, and then he was eventually elected chief. He was also himself a builder, a carpenter. He knew how to build buildings. That was his business. And so not only did he know how buildings went up, he knew how they could be taken down by fire. So he brought all this expertise into his role as a fire chief. And he loved Boston, and he did his best to make sure the city was protected. But like many many Cassandras or predictors of disaster, he was ignored. For example, in his annual reports of 1867, 68, 69, several reports I've looked at, and you can see all these online, he warns about the various weak points, the water problems, the lack of apparatus, the hydrants. He was constantly beating on the door saying, we need to pay attention to this, we need to pay attention to this. And what happened? He discovered that city officials believed he was just hired to do a job. He wasn't supposed to tell the city council what to do or how to do it. So in a matter of fact, in one particular exchange, he was told point blank, do not try to magnify the wants of your department or of your office so much. In other words, you're just trying to get more money for your department. You're trying to build yourself up as a kind of a czar, your own kingdom of apparatus and personnel. But in truth, he was really warning about what could happen in the city of Boston. Now, he was up against a number of issues. One of against was the reputation of his own department. People in Boston were very proud of that fire force, but that almost made them complacent. In fact, you can read that here. One editorialized it, well, it doesn't matter if one company gets to a fire first or another company gets to a fire first. It'll all work out because our people are good enough and we don't have to really worry about this. And so this was kind of an attitude in the city. Now, one thing that was going on at this time was fires in the urban fires. Major fires were decimating American cities, and this was all over Baltimore, San Francisco a little bit later, and of course, Chicago. Chicago, the big fire. Now, the big fire, when we talk about the Great Boston Fire of 1872, it does not compare to the Chicago fire. It was the death count was smaller, and we'll talk about that. The acreage was smaller, but there was one distinction of the Great Boston Fire, what I'll get into. But this happened just the year before, and it was typical of the kinds of fires that affected this area. I think the 250 people were killed in the Chicago fire, millions of dollars of damage spread over a wide area, and it scared firefighters all around the country, including John Damrell. In fact, John Damrell went to Chicago just a week or two after the Chicago fire. The Boston firefighters had raised money. He took it personally to Chicago to give it to the firefighters there and to see firsthand what the damage was and why the fire had spread. And what he saw chilled him to the bones, chilled him. He came back and redoubled his efforts, talked to the city council and said, look, this is what happened in Chicago. This is what could happen here. We are sitting on, not these words exactly, but we're sitting on a tinderbox. Don't be complacent. We really need to do something about that. And once again, he was largely ignored, except the city council agreed that he could have a new fireboat, a fireboat that would operate on the wharfs of the city and use water from the ocean to put out fires on the wharfs. He did get that. It went into effect a month after the Great Boston Fire. So the feeling in Boston was, well, yeah, Chicago was really bad, but that happened there. It's not going to happen in the Athens of America, or could it? Now, there's one other little side story about the Great Boston Fire, and this was a really kind of a, if you do history, you often go on these little side trails of stories, and I'd always heard about they called it an epizootic, a great horse epizootic, a pandemic for equines, and I'd always heard about that. But writing this book gave me a chance to look into it, since we were experiencing our own pandemic at this time. But again, let me set the scenes. At this time, this was horsepower. Horses drew everything. Now, they didn't pull trains, of course, there was a train system, but all the carts, all the trolleys, all the cabs, that's how people got around. So horses were still the lifeblood of the country in terms of transportation. And then sometime in October of 1872, a strange disease appeared in Canada and began to spread horse to horse around the country. And at this time, people didn't know what it was. There was no germ theory. They didn't even know what had never heard of a virus. And all of a sudden, horses started to become sick. Now, it didn't always kill them. It just made them, when you have a bad flu, I mean, you can't even crawl out of bed, So that's what's happened to horses. The horses were just really sick, too sick to work. But it started to spread around the country, very mysteriously. And there are all these theories about it. But what happened is when horses got too sick to work, men and women had to jump in. And you can see here some pictures from Harper. You'll see a lot of shots from Harper's Newsweekly, had a lot of great illustrations of the day. You see people starting to take the place of horses in terms of dragging them around the city. And in some cases, the horses were really sick and didn't make it. And so you had some really tragic situations here. This is a map of a professor actually tracked how this pandemic or equine epizootic spread. It started here and it spread all the way across the country. I think it spread into Mexico and obviously came from Canada, did not go to Europe. And what he found was that the horses were being spread by the railroads, because horses who seemed to be perfectly well were loaded up on trains and were transported, because that's how you got horses long distances. And by the time they got to the new location, they would be sick, but they'd already infected other horses. And so it spread across the country. And, it's interesting to me because we're in the middle of our own pandemic, and to look at this case back in the 1872 of horses, similar, a flu, mysterious causes, you get really sick, but mostly recovered, and that was the situation there. And it was of note by people around the country. In fact, it helped to buttress a growing animal rights or animal welfare movement organizations, which kind of centered in Boston. Angel Memorial is named for an activist at that time. And you can see this, and by the way, this illustration I think is by the famous Thomas Nast, who was a cartoonist who brought us the elephant and the donkey as symbols for the various political parties. So I was very interested in this epizootic, and now here's why. Because what pulled the fire engines? Horses. So if you didn't have horses to pull your fire engines, you couldn't get those fire engines quickly to a fire, because over the years they'd gotten very heavy. So Damerel, faced with the fact that all the city's fire horses were sick, and by the way, fire horses were really well trained. I mean, these were amazing creatures. They learned not to run when there was fire. They knew the sound of the bells in the stations. They knew to go under their stalls, and the halters would drop and they would take off. And so they were really, really well trained, and they were very beloved. And so these horses were getting sick. So it wasn't like you could just bring in healthy horses from somewhere else. You had very specially trained horses. And so Damerel was faced with, oh my God, how can we put out fires if we can't get to the fire very quickly? So he set up a system of reducing the number of fire engines that would respond to any one alarm. So basically he wanted to spread the effect of this lack of equipment around the area. So he had a whole elaborate system, and it seemed to be working, and the horses started to get better. But in the end, the problem sort of caught up with him. So here's the thing. I'm often asked, what caused the 1872 fire, this mass fire? What caused it? That's not the right question, because it wasn't just one thing. Fires were happening all the time, all over the country. What's the important thing is that this thing grew so big and became a conflagration of immense proportions. That's the real issue. Why did it spread? And the answer I have is it was a total systems failure. Not just one cause, not just one thing, but a number of factors. In fact, I gave a talk on this when I applied the NFPA's, the National Fire Protection Association's Fire and Life Safety Ecosystem. They talk about the causes of fire as an ecosystem, not necessarily one thing, but a series of things that cause problems in public safety in general. And I think this fits the story of the Great Boston Fire, that it was a systems failure on a number of different levels. So let's get into it. So on November 9th, 1872, Saturday night, about 7 o'clock in the downtown area, Kingston, I believe Summer Street, there was a fire seen in this building. It's actually in this building. And they don't know what caused it. It was probably a spark from the furnace in the basement, caught some flammable material, and the fire spread to an elevator shaft and started to shoot up. But by the time it was noticed, the fire had really spread through this building, so they really couldn't determine an exact cause. And this building was totally decimated. People about 7 o'clock noticed it and started screaming, "Fire, fire," which is the way that you got attention. And there was one other way to bring firefighters to a scene, and this is it. You know what this is, a firebox. And now we have them all over the place. And they were pioneered in the 1850s in Boston, actually. So there are boxes all over the city, and what you did was inside you cranked, it was a cranking mechanism. And the cranking mechanism basically sent a telegraph. Remember, there's no telephones and stuff. Telegraph message to the fire alarm headquarters. Fire alarm headquarters would see the location of the box, box 52. Okay. It would send a message to the fire stations that were nearest, and it would also ring church bells or city bells in the area to let people know where the fire was. 5, 2. 5 rings, pause, 2 rings. 5, 2, 52. And that's what happened. But there was a problem with these boxes. Here's a systems flaw. They were kept locked. They were kept locked because there was a fear that people would put in false alarms. So all over the city, you had these great boxes, but they were locked. And policemen all had a key, and somebody in the nearby area would have a key, but there was a delay in sending out the alarm. Like I said, it was seen around 7 o'clock. The first alarm didn't go in until about 24 minutes later, and then there was a series of alarms. They kept cranking it because they could see that the fire was spreading. It was out of control. And by the 4th alarm, each one of these alarms brings in more apparatus. So by the 4th alarm, it's just said, everybody in the city come to this location. So what happened is that the fire started that location. There's a map of downtown. And it doesn't look like it doesn't look like it does today because all the streets are now changed. And the city's been extended, so Atlantic Street is out here now, the Atlantic. So what happened is that the fire started spreading, and even though fire engines started coming, it got out of control very quickly. And part of it was because there was a delay, not a lot, not a big delay, but a slight delay in getting fire engines to the scene, because what was happening is the men were pulling the engines because they didn't have horses, they were pulling them. So they're converging here, but the fire started spreading, and there were a couple problems, and the reason that it spread. One is that those mansard roofs, the fire started spreading roof to roof of these wooden things, and that was very hard to get a stream of water up on the top of the roof. The other problem was that after a while they would run out of water because the water mains in this part of the downtown were too small to get enough pressure, to get enough water to get on the tops of these buildings, so they would be running out of water. The other thing was that many of these buildings were built of granite. And you think of granite, oh, that's a pretty tough material. Well, guess what? Granite has pockets of moisture in it. And this would get heated up from this fire, which generated very intense heat, and it would explode. Literally, firefighters were dodging exploding buildings and chunks of granites that were falling on them, falling on their equipment, cutting off hoses. So as you can see, spread, spread, spread. And this is a map from a documentary that was done on the fire, and you can see the kind of the relentless spread through the evening, through Saturday evening, throughout the city. I'll just show you this. This is kind of the area where the fire started, and you can just see how devastated it was. Now, there are no photographs of the actual fire. There was photography at this point, but it was not they didn't have enough light, it was during the night, and it was moving, the technology did not exist, but there were artists who got pictures, who drew the fire. And so these are some of the many illustrations of the fire. Summer Street, Franklin Street, and Winthrop Square. And you can kind of see the devastating effect. A couple things you can even see here, the streams aren't reaching the tops of the buildings. You see that here, see that here. Best way to fight a fire is to go from the top down, and that you couldn't quite reach it. And every time the firefighters seemed to be getting things out of control, they'd run out of water. So the fire took on almost a personality. It became a hurricane of sparks. It generated its own wind. It was not a time of a lot of wind, but as it moved, it was so hot. And here's an illustration of it. And it's interesting that the fire, all the reporters and the people who wrote about it had one name for it, the fire fiend. That's what they called it, the fire fiend, because it seemed so relentless. And as you can see, here's another example of, see, the bottom of the building was not involved, but the top of it is on fire. And that's because of those mansard roofs. So Damrell, who, by the way, heard the bells ring. He lived on Beacon Hill. He heard 5252. He knew exactly where that box was. He grabbed his hat and his axe. He ran. He ran to the fire, and he got there. And when he got there, he later said he'd never seen anything like it because the fire was already so involved. But as you can see, the firefighters were dealing with a lot of issues. People in the streets, a lot of people come to watch. Other people trying to grab their stuff, get it out of there. You can kind of get a sense of that. And so they had an issue of crowd control going on. They didn't know who was looting, who was just trying to save their own equipment, their own things. Some merchants even did things like they would see the fire coming, and there was a lot of people were converging in this area. If they couldn't get their stuff off, they started giving it away. And so it was a mess in terms of who was looting and who was just giving stuff away. Here's an illustration of Franklin Street before the fire, and here's an illustration of it during the fire. The scale of this fire was massive. I mean, this illustration might be a little bit exaggerated, but not so much. Basically, the fire could be seen, I'm told, some reference said 50 miles offshore, they could see it. It was extraordinarily dramatic. And as I said, it burned very hot, and firefighters were struggling to set up a kind of a front to keep the water on, and trying to set it up so they could push it back. And they kept having to fall back from that. Firefighters in this day, here's an illustration of them, where this is kind of overly dramatic, but these guys were up against it. They didn't have the safety equipment they do today. They didn't have like the breathing apparatus. All they had between them and the fire fiend was a hose and some water. And you can kind of get a sense of some are very determined, others are just scared out of their minds in trying to fight this fire. One aspect of the fire was that there was an effort to create fire breaks with dynamite. They would just try to blow things up. And, sorry, not dynamite, it wasn't dynamite, gunpowder. So at the time, there's this feeling, and this is a technique in firefighting. You burn a unit, you have a forest fire, and you burn a section of it, and the fire gets to that part and has no fuel, so it stops. And that was the idea that they applied to this fire, that they'd create a break. They'd blow up some buildings, and the fire couldn't jump over it. However, Damrell, under a lot of pressure, gave permission to groups of people who were coming to City Hall saying, we got to do something. He gave them permission to go blow up buildings. Unfortunately, didn't work very well. Fire jumped over it because there was another structural flaw, and that was gas mains. The city was then lit by gas lights. And what happened is that the gas could not be turned off block by block or house by house. It was controlled by a main center. And it took them a while to get to the main center, get a key and get in and turn off the gas, which put the whole city into darkness. But before they did that, they'd blow up the building, gas would continue to flow out. Eventually, it would ignite and the fire would spread. One of the issues in the ecosystem is the idea of the informed public. And I thought this was an interesting story. Patrick John, who was a really amazing person, actually, he was a publisher of the Pilot, which is still going on today, the Catholic newspaper. And apparently at some point he asked that a fire hydrant be removed from a building. He had just built a new headquarters for the Pilot in downtown Boston. He asked it, and that's a picture of it here, asked to be removed. We don't know why, we don't know how, there's one reference to it in the record. And of course, during the fire, he was there and he watched it burn down. So, and I think you all know of cases where people have had fire hydrants removed from their house or around their house. John Kerry, I'm looking at you. Anyway, so, all right. Now, one of the things that's interesting is the many people who watched this fire. Here's this great thing about comparing it to the last days of Pompeii, and that was Louisa May Alcott, who went out and watched the fire. Another person who watched fire was William Lloyd Garrison, who was a bit of a spark, interesting, but he went out and watched this fire and watched these things going on. And another witness the fire was Alexander Graham Bell, who was out. And it was really interesting going into this because no one had reported on this before I found it, and just from the internet where you can search for these things, it's a very cool thing to be able to find these different things. Graham, you'll notice here, he wrote an account for the Globe on it, and apparently they never published it. And there's no copy of it. And I'm like, oh, these damn editors, they didn't publish it. So that was kind of sad. We lost that to history. One thing Damrell did, he did his best. He was out on the front lines. He was marshaling his forces. He was directing people here and there, do this, do that. One thing he did very early on, he saw this fire was getting out of control. Very early on, he sent for help. He sent telegrams all over the New England area. So what happened, fire companies from as far away as Biddeford, Maine, and New Hampshire, and Connecticut, I think Rhode Island, converged onto Boston to try to help out. Now, obviously they're very far away, and even by horse it would take a long time, so they loaded up the trains, they loaded up their fire engines on trains. And the trains came into the city, and here's a picture of them being unloaded, and they were brought in to help out. And a lot of them didn't arrive till, now we're into Saturday night, Sunday morning. One of the companies came from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, a company, they called them by names in those days, and it was the Kearsarge. And the Kearsarge is credited for being fresh on the scene with fresh men and a very powerful, powerful engine, and was credited with saving the Old South, because the fire went all along Washington Street, and you can just see here, it burned right near the Old South Meeting House, which was the most historic building in the city. But this may be the Kearsarge, we don't know, these are kind of different things, but they managed to preserve it when all seemed lost. So Damrell and his men, with these extra help, all these people managed to stop the fire by setting up just rows and rows of fire engines along here and just a massive wall of water, and managed to not run out of water. They had done that over in Franklin Street, and they ran out of water, so it got pushed back, but they were able to do that there. So they were able to bring it under control. It was out by Sunday, late Sunday night into Monday. The gas continued to flow, and there was another explosion. So it really wasn't out till Monday. Here's a really great picture of some of the engines. It's after the fire, but you can see it's still burning. The steam engine, and that is to create the pressure to get water into the system. And finally out, and you have people now looking at their city and saying, what happened? Here's a overhead of the city before the fire, and here's after. And you just get the sense of this big chunk of the city taken out. It's a view of the skyline. So let's go over the tally of this. 776 buildings were destroyed, about 60 acres. About 20,000 people were left homeless. It was like, because the time of the year, the buildings were all filled with goods for the Christmas seasons in November. So millions of dollars of goods were destroyed in these warehouses and other things there. About 1,000 firms were burned out. In other words, they lost everything there. There was artwork, books, a lot of things, collectibles. There's also a record of everything that was destroyed in some of the warehouses there. 11 firefighters and 1 former firefighter were killed. Very high toll there. The damage, I think the figure they had then was 70 million, but today it would be over $1.6 billion in terms of cost. And it made it one of the most expensive fires per acre in U.S. history. Like I said, it wasn't as big or as broad or as destructive as the Chicago fire, but per acre, because this was a concentrated area of wealth, it was more expensive. What we don't know for certain is how many people were actually killed. There's been all these reports over the years. I did as much research as I could, and there was a very low number of people killed, and that was partly because the area was not residential. Only parts of it were residential. So we think between 20 and 30 people might have been killed, and these were people caught in the collapse that we know of. So it was a relatively low death count, which is another reason why I think Boston was able to recover. The firefighters, though, here are the names of the men. 2 of them were from Boston. The others were, as you can see, from all over the area, Malden, Worcester, and Connecticut, someone from Connecticut. It's only even a little clear exactly who was killed or injured. Again, the record is not all that clear, but we had headlines all over the country where a lot of them noticed Chicago repeated, second Chicago. There's a lot of feeling, oh, it's happening again. And this is Thomas Nast and his version of the morning of it. But there's some interesting aspects. Again, another side story, interesting aspects. Photographers didn't get pictures of the fire, but they wanted to get pictures of the devastation, so they rushed in. And there were some incredibly, hauntingly beautiful pictures taken by some of the best photographers of the day who rushed into what was called the burn district to get photos like this and to record what was going on. And many of these photos were sent around the country, the world, to newspapers, and they're turned into illustrations. Like, here's the photo, here's the illustration, because newspapers at that time could not print photos, so what they did was they printed illustrations. So news of this fire went all over the world. Some of them were able to even by taking a series of photos, created this panorama. They had a panorama. This is actually an illustration of the panorama that appeared in a newspaper. And it was interesting because William Lloyd Garrison, who was, like I said, a bit of a spark, he liked to go out to fires, and one of his sons gave him a picture of original print of the fire. He was just delighted. He thought it was the greatest thing. So there was a lot of photos of it, but there's another reason why they're doing this is because it wasn't just to collect it or for the news. There was a market for something called stereoscope cards. You know, the little Viewmasters. Did you have those as a kid? You see the 3D image. Well, apparently, this was something that was very popular in those days, and they turned a lot of these postcards into 3D images that you put them in a view master for the day, and you could see a 3D image, kind of, sort of. But you can still, it still works today. I should have brought some, but you can still see it. It's really amazing. So I bought a bunch of these these are not rare. I got them on eBay, so that means there were hundreds of them, thousands of them printed. So they were all over the place. So there was some money to be made out of this. And when I first saw this, I thought, oh, this is terrible. People want to see death and destruction. And then I thought about what I see at the movies. I don't know if you've been to the movies lately, especially the Marvel movies. Everything's always blowing up. It's like, let's blow up the White House. Let's blow up this. It's just death. It's just destruction all the place. So there's kind of this human interest in these devastating images. There was also a market in selling relics from the fire. I did a talk in the Hingham Bear Cove Fire Museum, and they had a box of relics from the fire, allegedly. including these beautiful letters. And then the Mass Historical Society, they actually had a relic there. That was very interesting. There's also a kind of what you would today we'd call disaster tourism. People flocked to the burn district to see with their own eyes what was going on, because it was all very interesting. So again, this was just a fascinating thing, and many of the businesses went right back and went to their spot and tried to keep going. Here are some signs. I mean, a lot of them couldn't find where they were, so they put the signs of where they had been and said, okay, we're not in business here, but we're in business elsewhere. So there was really an effort to keep things going. Many of the businesses were very interested in getting their safes. So one of the main things was they go to their areas and they'd open up their safes to see if money and books, the real important things, had survived the fire. And sometimes they found ashes, but sometimes they did find that their material had survived. And this was another commercial opportunity. This is a publication that came out about 11 days after the fire. They rushed into print. And on the back is an advertisement for a certain kind of Morris and Ireland safes, which may even be manufactured today, but all these testimonies about, sir, I used your safe and all my stuff survived the Great Fire. So it's another advertisement that came into this. Now, many of these businesses were covered by insurance, not all, but many of them were. So Boston started to rebuild almost immediately. And in a few years, they had really rebuilt. They were very lucky that they had insurance. Lloyd's of London was actually getting ready to cut off a lot of businesses because they knew of the dangerous conditions in the downtown, but they hadn't gotten around to doing it, so a lot of these businesses were recovered. And so the city rebuilt. They did not straighten a lot of people said, we should straighten out the streets in downtown. And if you've been there lately, no, they didn't. Still kind of a warren in there. So they were able to rebuild. But of course, Boston being Boston, they formed a commission to find out what went wrong and who was responsible and what we should do about it. And guess who they blamed? The fire chief, of course. That's who they. So he came in for a round of criticism. They said he should have been more of a general. He shouldn't have been out in the front lines. His use of dynamite, of gunpowder was criticized. There was a lot of, and even though in his testimony, this is how we know that he complained about these conditions, because we have his testimony. So there's like 300 to 400 pages of testimony from all the people, witnesses to this fire. And he talked very candidly about how he was put down, but he got a lot of blame anyway. The aftermath is that, unfortunately, the city had a number of bad fires afterwards before they really started to make major improvements in the infrastructure in the downtown. But eventually there's greater attention to building materials and zoning and prevention. The water system was improved eventually in this area, and the fire department was reorganized, although that was, again, a blow to Damrell. And there were, like I said, there were attempts to straighten the streets, but that didn't happen. Now, here's the thing about Damrell, and this is why I just love this character. I love him as a character, I love him as a person, is that after the fire, he was reelected fire chief, but then the city said, oh, we're going to reorganize the fire department, and he said, well, that wasn't the real problem, I'm leaving. So he resigned. And he could have just left. He could have gone back to just his building trade, which was profitable. He could have just licked his wounds in seclusion, and he chose not to. He organized something called the International Association of Fire Chiefs, which continues as a very major international organization, continues to this day. And these are the people who started to put their heads together and say, how can we stop the cities of America and around the world from burning down? And then in 1877, he took the position of basically the building inspector or the building commissioner. And he kept that job for the next 2 decades, and he continued to make moves to make Boston a safer place. So he didn't leave civic life. He stuck it out. Even though he was widely criticized and he was even sued by people about whose buildings were exploding, he stuck in there and he continued to work and work and work to make the city a safer place. He worked to establish the National Model Building Code, which is something that was passed by the NFPA and is now used as a way to keep buildings and other structures and other systems safe. And his son also served as building commissioner. He died, I don't have his date here, but he died and he's buried in the fireman's lot or firefighter's lot in the Forest Hill Cemetery. And this is his grave here at this time. Just a couple things to kind of wrap the story up. Remember I told you about the Kearsarge, the fire company from New Hampshire who rushed down and helped to save the Old South? Well, through a set of circumstances, the Kearsarge, that fire engine was preserved and saved and was eventually restored. And in 2010, the Boston Fire Historical Society, which I'm a member, I was a founding member of that, we brought it back to Boston and put it on the exact spot where it might have been. And it wasn't even fully restored. And we put it downtown. And it was like, I don't know if you've heard of the expression steampunk. It was like the steampunk thing in the middle of downtown, but it was absolutely wonderful. And people were taking pictures of it. It was really cool. And I hope to do it again. I hope we can do it again at some point. Today, Box 52 is still kind of there. This is a box. It's actually a different number in the Boston fire system, but it's actually labeled Box 52 and has a special thing on top, but this is still there. You can see it. Most of the other plaques and things about the Great Fire have disappeared. There used to be some. There are a few, but a lot of them are disappeared. But the Old South is still there, and they still remember how that they were saved by the Kearsarge during this time. And the other nice thing, in 2011, the Boston Fire Department got, I think I have it wrong, Boston Fire Department, not FBFD, got a new fire boat, and they called it the John S. Damrell, to memorize him. So, to explain, in the 19th century, we faced urban fires. Urban fires were decimating the cities. Today, we have a problem with wildland fires, forest fires. Those are what's threatening us right now. And you can only go outside and look at the sky in the last few days and know what's happening in Canada and then know what's happening in California. That is the biggest threat to us today in terms of a public safety hazard. Not in the cities, but in the wildland. And so I like to say the fire fiend has not disappeared. It's just taking another form. I want to tell you just briefly, I've also written a book about the Coconut Grove fire, which we have some copies here. And then I have a new book that just came out on the Boston Harbor Islands. And there's no death and no destruction in that one. And I'm so happy about that. We have that. But let me put this up. The Great Boston Fire, like I said, not a lot of people know about it today. People walk through the downtown area. They don't realize they're walking on ash. They're walking in an area that was once devastated. But there are a couple of things I'll draw attention to. One is Damrell's Fire, which is an amazing documentary that was done. Some of the material from in this slideshow came from that, and it really they used computer animation to show how the fire spread. If you want to dive in a little deeper, you can go to the Boston Fire Historical Society's sites and look at that. And then the Boston Public Library has beautiful photos. Actually, it's now Digital Commonwealth. That's actually outdated here. But if you want to see pictures of the fire, of the aftermath of the fire, you can go and look at it yourself. They are amazing, crisp, clear, beautiful photos of this destruction. And every time I look at them, I'm just amazed at this level of devastation that is now all but disappeared. But the one thing I want to leave you with is this idea of a systems problem. That when we talk about fires, it's not necessarily one thing. It's not necessarily how it started, but how it spreads, how a fire spreads, and why aren't there systems to stop it at different steps in the way. And that's something I think we have to think about when we're trying to protect public safety, is to think about systems approach. So let me end right there. I'd love to take some questions, and thank you again for your indulgence. And I'd love to entertain any questions. Yes, yes, sir, and I'll tell you what, is anyone here? I'll bring back the mic.
I can talk loud.
Okay, well,
You showed a film, a slide where you had you said all the fire engines were lined up on a certain side.
Right.
But what eventually stopped the fire from going? Did they hit a spot where there was less homes, or was it just the firemen putting water on it?
It was just, it was basically just the firemen putting water on it, because the Boston Fire, companies were supplanted with others from all around the area. So they're able to pull, into, a formation that stopped them. Now, the fire burned all the way to the wharfs. So it was stopped on one side by the ocean. So that's why it didn't spread that way. And it seemed to spread in a kind of north direction. That had to do with the wind, and even though the fire kind of created its own wind. But yes, it is a little hard to fathom how they're able to do it, but it was really by massing the forces in one, it kind of burned in one area, and they managed to they managed to mass the engines in a way and able to stop it. But it really took more than 24 hours to do it, to really stop it, yeah. Difficult. And, yeah, is there another mic? Do we have another mic here? Oh, we do. Is this working?
I can run it
Yeah, if
around.
you could run it down to the lady down there. Great. Thank you for the question. That was great. These are, it's one of the things I did in terms of research. That I had a long talk with Paul Christian, who's a former Boston Fire Commissioner and Fire Chief, and he just relates to the situation. We talked a lot about Damrell and Damrell's techniques, and whether he could be faulted for anything with this fire. The only thing he could fault him was that at the initial part that not enough engines responded immediately, and that was because of the epizootic rules that kind of limited the number of people who responded on the first alarm. Anyway, question, ma'am.
You had a representation of the building in which they believe the fire originated. What was the function of the building? Was it like primarily residential, or?
Yeah, it was actually a small factory. It was actually a retail outlet for clothes and men's goods, so it was filled with material. In fact, it had hoop skirts in there, and people recorded seeing the hoop skirts catching on fire and sailing through the air like that. So it was chocked with different, like I said, clothing and leather goods, and there were actually 3 businesses in there. They operated on different levels. So it was a retail. So this area was retail, warehouses, and light manufacturing, such as small factories in a lot of the buildings at that time. Yes.
Anybody else? I'm coming. Thank you.
What happened to all the rubble afterwards? I know in Chicago they made a landfill along Lake Michigan.
Right. Actually, similar thing. The rubble was put into the water, was used as landfill as well. In fact, the South Boston or the Fort Point Channel area, a lot of that is built on rubble from the Great Boston Fire. In fact, the Boston Fire Museum, which is in that area, is said to be right on some of the rubble from the Great Boston Fire. So a lot of it was just moved out, and they used it to fill the harbor. As you know, we've extended the harbor we've extended into land into the harbor right now. So yes, a lot of it was used as landfill, just like Chicago.
I have a question.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm assuming that back then people didn't always think it they were accidental. Was there any kind of rudimentary arson investigation?
There was,
Did they ever
yes,
do that?
yes, there was a lot of investigation of the fire. I mean, that commission was really looking at what happened. They interviewed the owner of the building, they interviewed the guy, the caretaker who was there, who said everything was in order when he went back. So a lot of those things were investigated. There was no indication that it was arson, no indication. But they don't really know. Basically, it's of unknown origin, as they say. They believe we know the building it started in. They knew it started somehow, probably in the basement, which had a furnace, and a spark may have come out of the wood-burning furnace and caught some combustible material. And then there was an elevator shaft that actually had wood in it, and that caught fire. And then it shot up and it caught the mansard roof that was on top. And the building became engulfed almost like, by the time the firefighters were there, the building was engulfed and it started burning buildings nearby. So that was one of the reasons that it got out of control. But it started in one place. It wasn't like people setting fire around the city. It started in one place. And then the sparks sent it out, and the exploding granite sent it out and sent it moving around the city, or in an area, and then it spread through the city. Yes, sir.
You showed a slide that said, and I was confused, you mentioned 60 acres.
Yes.
What was the 60 acres in reference to?
To what they call the burn area.
I mean, for the fire that we're seeing on, like, your front cover,
Yeah.
that's 60 acres?
Well, this represents, I think, right at the wharf. I think it burned in. I'll tell you what, let me see if I can back up the slides, and I can give you a little better picture of that.
Because if that was 60 acres, does anybody know in Needham what's a 68-acre parcel that we could reference? The high school or something like that?
Let me see. Well, like, for example, this is the burn, this is, let's see, slideshow. Here we go, hang on. Okay, so basically, this is what they called the burn area. And that was the area of the city that was decimated, okay? You see it burned right to the wharf. This is the wharf here. Washington Street, my laser pointer ran out on me. But Washington Street's on top there, and so it burned up to there. And so here, it got close to City Hall, but didn't quite make it to City Hall. And you can kind of get a sense of this downtown. For those people who are familiar with downtown, you can get a sense of it. The streets have changed now. They're a little bit different, but that's it. I don't know how to relate it to Needham. I wish I did. I'm sorry. That
I
gives
have
you
a question.
Yes.
Can you tell us about the rebuilding effort, how it was financed, and did most of the businesses resurrect themselves, and who paid for it?
They paid for that themselves. There was interesting because many of them did have insurance, and they were able just to kick in and start over again. So yes, some people were ruined, but it was surprising how quickly Boston recovered. And it wasn't because they were getting money from a government agency. There were some efforts to help some of the people who were homeless, and a number of women worked in a lot of the little factories in the area, and they were thrown out of work, and a women's group went to help those people out. And there was some argument at the time of how much to help people. I mean, it was very similar to today. How much do you help people? How much does that make people lazy? I mean, there were a lot of discussions about that even at the time. But that money was not for the businesses. The businesses were basically on their own. But there was some effort to help some of the poor people who are. I didn't find much reference to homelessness, helping the homeless. It was more about the women who were thrown out of work at the time. So there was a women's group that helped that out. But the businesses, I mean, it's interesting, there was a lot, even William Lloyd Garrison, he said, at one point, he said that the burden of this has fallen on those who are more able to withstand it. So there was a feeling that many of the businesses could handle this setback, and they did. It's a little unclear. I mean, different groups lost money. I mean, I keep running into like a Simmons College, I think it was, had some money in this, and they lost it. But the wealthy survived mostly from it. So there wasn't the sense that it devastated the economy for years and years. And actually, here's the irony of it, is that after the fire, the property in the area became more valuable. So actually, real estate prices increased. So increased the value of that because now they're able to rebuild it and do things with it. So there's a lot of weird little quirks about this fire in terms of its economic impact. There's a really great master's thesis or PhD thesis by a woman who wrote in the 1970s, and she looked at it from the viewpoint of why didn't Boston use this opportunity to remake its downtown. And it's interesting to read that now because she wrote in the 70s when the downtown was, going downhill, and things were very undervalued at that time. You look at it now, and you realize how valuable that's. I mean, that's something I've watched in terms of writing about the downtown area and the uptick of it. So it's interesting the different economic forces that come to play when you kind of wipe out an area and you're able to rebuild on it.
We have one more question? No, I guess that's it. Stephanie's books are for sale, both The Coconut Grove and The Great Fire of Boston, as well as her new book on the Boston Harbor Islands up front. So please come buy a book, meet Stephanie, say hello, and we'll see you again in the fall.
Thank you guys
Thank you.
very much. Appreciate it.